Anyone got an extra pass rusher lying around? Grossi Posse Packer Nation, welcome to an episode of Podcast, the podcast where you don't, I do Packers fan, but it sure does help. I'm your host, Tom. No, really, we need a pass rusher, Grossi, and today we are going to be recapping all of the Green Bay Packers' 3 moves in free agency, which is not a ton, but hey, it's something to talk about. I also think it's going to allow the Packers some flexibility heading into the draft. We'll kind of take stock of, all right, what's next for the Packers, not only in the draft, but what they need to be looking for going forward, how this is going to impact the team, and taking a look at each acquisition. And so let's start off with our largest acquisition first, and that is, of course, Aaron Banks, the left guard that we got from the San Francisco 49ers, signed him to a 4-year, $77 million deal. And immediately after looking at that contract, just when they first got announced, I was like, oh, damn, that is a lot of money. Now, Aaron Banks has been a pretty damn good starter for the 49ers these past 3 years. He's been their left guard since 2022. He's a former second-round pick. And after diving into the contract a little bit more, only $27 million are actually guaranteed. And if the Packers really want to, there is an out after this next season, which is not surprising. That's usually how the Packers are building their contracts and saying, hey, you know what, these first couple of years, or maybe even just 1 year, you're going to get your guaranteed money. And then after that, it's going to kind of fall off a cliff or be non-existent. And this makes a lot of sense, as O-line was one of my top 5 needs the Packers needed heading into the draft. And now this gives them the flexibility to work around in the draft that they don't need to go out and spend a day 1 or even maybe a day 2 pick on offensive line if the board doesn't fall their way. And in terms of Aaron Banks, he's only allowed 1 sack this past season, has only had a handful of penalties, and I think is a nice starter for the Packers. And like I said, gives them that flexibility to move guys around because that is what they're going to need to do. Josh Myers took a walk and now is with the New York Jets. And ultimately, we're going to have to move somebody already on that line to center. I think the major target is going to be Elton Jenkins. I wouldn't be surprised. He's already taken some snaps at center, which means that we are going to need to shift some things around. Now, of course, the Packers took a big swing this past draft and drafted Jordan Morgan in the first round, and Packers are still saying, hey, he could still play at one of the tackles and potentially left tackle, but we haven't seen a ton of Jordan Morgan, so I'm curious of what that configuration is going to look like. But again, having depth at offensive line, we talked about this during the Power Rankings episode. You look at the teams around the division who are building up their trenches, right? The Bears are doing it, the Lions did it for years, and the Vikings are doing it as well. And the Packers, especially with Goody, you can never have too many offensive linemen. And considering the predicament they're going to find themselves in, I'm not surprised at all that they're willing to take a big swing on an offensive lineman here in Aaron Banks. Considering that Zach Tom, who's going to get a ton of money after this season, and Rasheed Walker are both in their final years of their contract. Who knows what's going to happen with Rasheed Walker, if the Packers are going to let him walk after this season, but I imagine Zach Tom is going to get a hefty contract. But more importantly, if a guy like Rasheed Walker does walk away after this next season and goes to another team because the Packers can't afford him or whatever the reason may be, they're going to have an extra offensive lineman who is a proven starter, which is what Aaron Banks is. And so now I think looking forward, the Packers are probably still going to address offensive line in the draft, but as I said before, there's not this urgency that they need to do it on day 1 or day 2. And as we know, Goody usually does pretty darn well at picking offensive linemen, especially late gems in day 2 or day 3, except we're not going to talk about Josh Myers because we're just going to forget that ever happened. But ultimately for the Packers, I like this move, and even though the contract is a little hefty, protecting Jordan Love is one of the highest priorities that you can have, because when the offensive line is gelling, Jordan Love does play better, which makes a lot of sense because quarterbacks usually play better behind offensive lines. And so here, while this is not a huge splash, it's not a big name, I think this gives the Packers plenty of ammunition to move around within the draft and potentially leave an offensive lineman, or at least that depth piece, until day 3. Following that, the other signing that the Packers did was going and getting a corner, another need of the Packers, and they went out and got Nate Hobbs from the Las Vegas Raiders. He signed a 4-year, $48 million contract. This contract I like a whole lot. Only $16 million of that contract is actually guaranteed. He's a former 5th-round pick. He has missed time the past 3 seasons, which is not so great, but should sound very familiar to Packers fans, considering the Packers just let Eric Stokes walk away and go to the Raiders. So it looked like we had a little bit of a CB swap going on. And heading into this past season, we knew that we were going to have to address our secondary. The Packers really revamped that entire safety room by not only going and getting Xavier McKinney, but also getting Javon Bullard, who also played CB a little bit as well this past season. But with the Packers heading into this offseason, there are even more question marks because you had Keyshawn Nixon, who doesn't want to return kicks anymore. More about that in a minute. But on top of that, you also have Carrington Valentine, who has been a pretty damn good starter. However, the big question is Jaire Alexander, and all of the rumors and all the stories, and as of recording right now, is about Jaire Alexander likely not being on the Packers. Not only are they going to have to restructure a deal because it's not his final year of the deal, but they're going to have to restructure because I don't think the Packers are going to be paying Jaire Alexander that money. And everything that I have heard is that those two sides are just not really coming together. So I would not be surprised if Jaire Alexander gets traded in the near future. And hell, maybe even after recording this video, he is going to get traded. And so the Packers have a desperate need at CB. And I don't think Nate Hobbs is going to potentially solve that problem. But if you put Nate Hobbs in the slot and let Keyshawn Nixon play outside like he did last season, I think you're at least going to have a solid secondary, though it is going to still be one of my biggest needs heading into the draft. So I would not be surprised whatsoever if the Packers swing big early on day one and go and get a CB. I wouldn't be surprised if they double dip, especially if they wind up moving off Jaire Alexander, which again, looks like that is going to be the case. Now, of course, the concerns with Hobbs are going to be those injuries. We just dealt with Eric Stokes, who had a ton of speed and a ton of promise in his rookie year, but unfortunately just couldn't stay healthy and stay on the field. For Hobbs, you hope that things are going to turn itself around. Talking to some Raiders fans, Hobbs definitely had that potential, and with a low-risk contract, only $16 million guaranteed, I think this makes a lot of sense for the Packers. I do not think it solves all their problems in the secondary, and like I said, they are going to have to go and get a CB in the draft, but this is a nice move for a low cost, and let's see if it can make that secondary even better. And finally, to round out what the Packers did in free agency, they signed Mecole Hardman to a one-year deal. And as of recording this video right now, those contract details have not been released. But Mecole Hardman, the speedster, coming over to the Green Bay Packers. Of course, Mecole Hardman is best known for his time with the Chiefs and catching the game-winning touchdown in the Super Bowl. Of course, he did spend some time with the Jets, but that was very short-lived and nothing really came out of that. But in terms of signing Hardman, this is not really moving the needle. However, I think it's addressing a need. Keyshawn Nixon, after this past season, came out and said, hey, I don't want to return kicks anymore. And Matt LaFleur was like, ha, 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 I bet he doesn't. But here you go. Now you have Mecole Hardman, and so Keyshawn Nixon, who right now is rocking as one of our top CBs, he no longer has to do kick return duty. And I think here, just a one-year deal, taking a flyer on him, it can't hurt. I imagine the contract details are not going to be significant. I don't think he's going to be getting paid a ton of money. But I also want to be very clear, I don't imagine seeing him having a huge role as a wide receiver. Yes, he has the speed, but he hasn't really been great in that department for a little bit at this point. And so I imagine he's just going to be relegated to returning kicks. Now, could things change as the Packers definitely have a need at wide receiver? Absolutely. But for this is the kind of stuff that the Packers are used to. It's a low-risk contract. It's addressing a need. And for Nixon, who's going to be one of our starting CBs this year, this reduces the injury risk, which I am all about. So again, I don't think this is going to really help the Packers in the wide receiver department, which is a need, but it allows us to get a returner for what is likely to be a low price. And for that, I'm satisfied. And so I can't imagine the Packers are going to be doing too much in free agency. Like I said, they're probably going to move off Jaire Alexander, and we'll see what the capital they're going to get back in return is going to look like. But after last year making a big splash with McKinney and Josh Jacobs, the Packers didn't go out and get big names this past offseason. They missed out on DK Metcalf, who signed a mega deal, and it also cost them a second-round draft pick with the Pittsburgh Steelers. Trey Hendrickson still hasn't been moved, and again, maybe that has changed by the time I'm recording this, but I don't think the Packers are going to spend that kind of draft capital that it would take to bring in Hendrickson and give him all that money. And I've heard from a bunch of Packers fans who anticipated that the Packers were going to be big movers in free agency. They were going to go after and get some of those big names. But ultimately, Goody had this to say to them.
It's just, what do we get? What do we get? What do we get? You get nothing!
And I want to be very clear here. I think the Packers, what they did in free agency is not moving the needle a ton. I think the Aaron Banks signing makes the most amount of sense because you're just getting additional protection for Jordan Love. And again, that flexibility not only in the draft, but you're going to be moving around guys on that offensive line. That gives the Packers the ability to do so. But ultimately, just because you're spending a ton of money doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be good. But that being said, the Packers still have some major issues that they need to address. They need to go out and get a pass rusher. You could look at another linebacker. linebacker. They need to go get another corner. They need to go get a wide receiver. All these things need to be addressed, and I imagine they will be addressed in the draft. The only issue that the Packers really face, though, is that these guys still need to develop, especially when it comes to wide receivers and, of course, edge rushers, because the Packers have taken big swings, especially in the first round, on those edge players. And looking at guys like LVN, they need to take that next step and develop. And even in terms of Rashawn Gary, who developed very nicely, he needs to take that next step as well. And so the Packers are definitely going to need to address some things in the draft. We'll talk about that in a separate video. But overall for the Packers, there wasn't a whole lot of splashy signings. There wasn't a whole lot of needle movers here. But especially on the offensive line, I like that they have some flexibility and some depth there. And in terms of CB, who knows what's going to happen with Hobbs? It's a little bit of a risk, but they got rid of Eric Stokes and basically brought in a guy who has been a starter for the past couple years. Yes, he does have an injury history, but if he can stay healthy, it will not make that secondary worse. And for that, I got to be pretty happy and hope that the Packers are able to hit on some players in the draft, because otherwise, I'm going to cry. But let me know what you think down in the comments below. How'd you feel about the Packers this free agency? Let me know. You know, I saw me at TomGrossiComedy.com or at TomGrossiComedy, all social media, see down below. A big shout and thank you to all the Patreon and YouTube members for supporting this channel. And thank you so much for watching. I'm Tom Grossi. And as always, go Pack Go.